Between 1848 and 1863, something occurred on a stretch of land so quiet that even the birds seemed afraid to sing there. It was called Briar Hollow Plantation, located deep in the swamplands of northern Louisiana, 40 miles from the nearest town. For 15 years, not a single enslaved woman from that property was ever recorded as missing, captured, or run away. Not one. During the same period, at least 14 men escaped, some caught, some never seen again. But the women, they remained, every single one of them. Historians have puzzled over this for decades. What kind of place could trap the will of every woman forced to live there? Plantation ledgers reveal something far stranger than fear. The women of Briar Hollow were sold at prices 2 and 3 times higher than those from neighboring estates. Bills of sale describe them in language rarely seen outside livestock auctions: prime lineage, verified fertility, stable temperament. Every entry carried a number, a date, and a strange notation, letters arranged like a code beside each woman's name. These notations appeared nowhere else in regional records. For years, scholars dismissed it as an accounting anomaly. But in 1871, when a flood exposed the lower foundations of the plantation's west barn, locals uncovered what those letters truly marked: an underground structure no one had spoken of publicly, a place so deliberately concealed that even the surviving workers claimed ignorance. They called it the breeding cellar. And that's where the story changes, because the moment that hidden room was found, every remaining woman from Briar Hollow vanished within a week. Before we continue, if you're hearing this from anywhere in the world, I want to know where truth still echoes. Comment your city or state below, and if stories like this, forgotten, forbidden, silenced, speak to something inside you, subscribe now. What you're about to hear isn't legend. It's a record buried beneath polite history. Now, type this phrase twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. What was hidden still breathes beneath the soil. Because tonight, you're going to learn why no slave woman ever ran away from Briar Hollow, and why, when they finally saw what waited below, not one of them stayed. Briar Hollow stretched across 600 acres of rich delta soil, surrounded by magnolia trees whose roots ran as deep as the secrets buried beneath them. The estate belonged to Colonel Abram Vance, a man descended from a line of planters who prided themselves on discretion more than grandeur. His house was small for a man of his wealth. No marble columns, no grand staircase. Just a whitewashed 2-story home that looked ordinary to any traveler passing along the dirt road. But it was never meant to draw eyes. It was meant to contain them. Vance's reputation was curious. Church-going, charitable, and soft-spoken, he was known for maintaining an orderly plantation. Visitors often remarked that his people appeared healthy, even content. The women especially were described as strong, clear-skinned, and remarkably fertile. At local auctions, buyers paid staggering sums for those marked as from Briar Hollow stock. The plantation's books, now held in the Monroe County archives, read less like farm records and more like laboratory notes. Entries measured to the ounce and minute. Each woman was catalogued with an assigned code, 2 letters and 4 digits: HSO453T, MZO2NT, ALZO329. Each code corresponded to a symbol stamped on a wooden tag kept in a locked cabinet in the overseer's quarters. The purpose of this catalogue was unknown until much later. Visitors recalled oddities they dismissed at the time. The western barn, larger than needed for tobacco, larger even than most cotton gins, stood apart from the others, fenced with iron gates though it held no livestock. At night, faint lamplight flickered through its boards. No one dared ask why. The enslaved men whispered about the cellar that breathes, but they said little else. In 1857, a traveling physician from New Orleans named Dr. Elias Brandt visited the estate to inspect a shipment of laborers purchased by Vance's cousin. Brandt's journal, preserved in the state archives, described his unease. The ratio of women to men here defies logic, nearly 2 to 1. The women seldom leave the quarters. Some bear identical marks upon their arms, small circular scars as if from heated metal. I am told it signifies their group, though no one will say what kind. He left 2 days later and never returned. Within a year, his name appeared again, on a death record filed in Baton Rouge, cause unknown fever. When Union troops advanced through Louisiana in the spring of 1863, most plantations were abandoned, burned or looted, but Briar Hollow remained eerily untouched. Officers who passed through later wrote that the place felt unnaturally still, as if sound itself refused to linger. Inside the main house they found no valuables, no silver, no gold, only a single iron-bound trunk resting at the foot of the master's bed. Inside it lay the Book of Names. It was not a Bible, though it looked like one, thick, leather-bound, edges gilded. Every page filled with looping handwriting that blurred the line between record-keeping and obsession. Line after line of female names, birth dates, coded letters, and numbers. Some were struck through with red ink, others underlined in blue. In the margins, Colonel Vance had made cryptic notes: cycle stable, retain, cross breed to AL line, exceptional recovery, document pattern. Say one officer, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, later testified that he burned the book immediately out of disgust. But another soldier, a young clerk named Ezekiel Warren, claimed to have taken a few torn pages for evidence. Those pages surfaced decades later in an estate sale in Shreveport, where they were purchased by a collector of Civil War artifacts. His descendants donated them to the Louisiana Historical Society in 1924. What the archivists found on those sheets confirmed suspicions whispered for generations. Each code corresponded to a woman's identity and her reproductive record. Next to each child's name was a note indicating either SOLD or HELD. Some pages listed fathers not by name, but by physical trait. Height, complexion, muscle tone. Others simply read, pair successful, repeat. These were not farm logs. They were genetic experiments written in human suffering. When questioned by investigators after the war, surviving workers spoke little of the colonel. They said only one phrase again and again. The women stayed because the cellar called them. No official ever confirmed what that meant. No cellar was reported in the inventory. Yet, rumors spread of an underground chamber, windowless, soundproof, accessible only through the barn floor. A place where the women were taken when was their season. And when they came back, they were never quite the same. They said you could hear it before you saw it. A slow, rhythmic pulse beneath the barn floor, like the sound of someone breathing through a wall. The enslaved men called it the hollow lung. Overseers called it nonsense. But every woman at Briar Hollow knew the rhythm. It began at dusk and ended at dawn, every seventh night like clockwork. After the war, a freedman named Samuel Griggs, one of the last living witnesses, described it in an 1898 interview recorded by a journalist from the Times-Picayune. His hands shook as he spoke. It weren't no ghost. It was air, pushing out of the ground, like the earth itself was alive. They made the women go down there when the bell tolled twice. Always the women, never the men. A Griggs claimed the entrance lay beneath the western barn, under a hatch covered by hay. It led to a spiral staircase carved into limestone, descending 30 feet underground. The cellar walls were lined with brick slick with moisture. Along one side ran iron chains and hooks. On the other, rows of beds, each fitted with leather restraints. When Union troops later dug there, the passage had collapsed. The staircase was filled with mud and bone fragments, but fragments of a metal table and a rusted pulley system were recovered, objects inconsistent with farm tools. Local legend insists that Colonel Vance used the cellar for medical improvements, experiments meant to refine his labor force. But those who worked the fields whispered a darker truth, that something down there grew, something that needed them. Survivors said the women who went down returned marked, not just scarred but changed. Some lost their voices entirely. Others spoke strange phrases in the night, words that no one could recognize. A few became violently ill before vanishing without a trace. When the colonel died suddenly in 1862, his cause listed simply as rupture of the heart. His overseer sealed the hatch with iron and poured lime over the barn floor. To this day, the ground there refuses to grow grass. Before we go deeper, type this twice to keep your courage steady. The earth remembers what man tried to hide, because what comes next is not myth, it's testimony. Her name in the records was EH0453. But the older folks on the plantation called her Mercy. No one remembered her birth name. She came to Briar Hollow in 1849, purchased from a Georgia auction at only 16. The ledgers describe her as exceptionally resilient, mixed heritage, high recovery rate. That last phrase, high recovery rate, appears beside only 4 names in the entire book. Mercy worked in the kitchen at first, then as a midwife's helper. She was quiet, sharp-eyed, always listening. The other women said she kept count of everything: births, deaths, nights without stars. They also said she had a gift she could sense when the cellar was about to open. According to an oral history collected by the WPA in the 1930s, Mercy once whispered to a younger girl, "Don't look at the light under the door. It ain't a lamp, it's a mouth." In the spring of 1855, her name appeared in the Book of Names beside the word prime. 2 weeks later, she was taken below. She was gone for 3 nights. When she returned, she didn't speak for a month. The women said her eyes had changed color, dark brown to pale hazel, and her hands trembled constantly. She refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to lie beneath the magnolia trees, saying the roots kept her safe from the breathing. Mercy began carving symbols into the walls of the quarters. Circles within circles, lines that intersected like compass points. At first, overseers thought it was madness. But after her carvings appeared, the cellar's rhythm stopped for 3 weeks. When it started again, it was weaker, slower. Then came the night the barn burned. Witnesses later said Mercy walked into the field carrying a torch made from her bedding. She never screamed, never ran. She set fire to the western barn, then stood there until it collapsed. By dawn, the cellar had caved in, and Mercy was gone. When Union soldiers arrived years later, they found a single carving on the barn's remaining stone, a circle with a line through the center. The same mark burned into Mercy's left palm. Locals call it the sign of the hollow. If you're still here, say it aloud now. Mercy lit the fire, and the ground still breathes her name. In 1871, nearly a decade after the war ended, Reverend Isaac Monroe, a traveling minister and amateur historian, passed through the ruins of Briar Hollow. By then the estate was little more than a charred skeleton. 1 stone chimney, a collapsed barn, and the faint outline of slave quarters half buried in weeds. Locals warned him not to linger after dusk, claiming the air moved wrong near the western field. But Monroe was a man of faith and curiosity, not fear. He camped there overnight. The next morning, he found something carved into the base of the old chimney, a message written in uneven letters, half burned, half preserved by soot. Tichi tuarko uarnamus bt nautiuarotes be tichi roti uarit. Monroe copied the words into his journal, describing the scriptures. Neither the hand of a white man nor the tremor of old age. Firm, deliberate, feminine. Beneath the inscription lay a shallow mound. He dug only a few inches before striking wood, a box, hand-carved, sealed with pitch. Inside were scraps of linen covered in symbols, circles intersecting, lines crossing like constellations. One scrap bore a name written in ash and dried blood, Mercy. The Reverend took the box to a colleague at the University of Louisiana, Professor Charles Ellery, who spent months studying the markings. Ellery concluded they were not random. They formed a map. The intersecting lines matched the root systems of the magnolia trees still growing on the property. At the map's center, marked by 3 small circles, was the spot where the western barn once stood. Monroe and Ellery returned that autumn with shovels and lanterns. Beneath 2 feet of soil, they discovered a cavity lined with stone, no larger than a small cellar. Inside they found bones, dozens of them, arranged in deliberate spirals, each marked with the same burned symbol Mercy had carved years before. The men sealed the site and filed a brief report with the local parish office. The report vanished within weeks. Monroe never preached again. Ellery left the university, moved north, and refused to discuss Briar Hollow for the rest of his life. Locals say that if you stand beneath the magnolia trees after midnight, the air still moves as if something below is drawing breath. Type this twice if you dare to remember. The roots remember. The cellar sleeps. In the summer of 1936, a team of WPA archaeologists returned to the overgrown ruins of Briar Hollow as part of a statewide preservation project. Officially, they were there to catalogue antebellum architecture of historical interest. Unofficially, several had read fragments of Reverend Monroe's journal, which had quietly circulated among scholars for decades. What they uncovered over the next 6 weeks was never published in any state report. The site appeared ordinary at first: stone foundations, rusted farm tools, fragments of porcelain and pipe stems. But on the 12th day, a young surveyor named Leland Carter struck something hollow beneath a magnolia tree near the western field. Beneath a thin crust of soil was a slab of granite, perfectly smooth, engraved with faint circular markings. When they lifted it, cold air escaped a low hiss like a sigh. A narrow passage spiraled downward. Carter descended first, lantern in hand. He reached a chamber no larger than a single room. Inside were 32 shallow depressions in the dirt floor, each the size of a grave. At the chamber's center lay a single magnolia root, thick as a man's torso, piercing through the ceiling and curling along the walls like a living vein. Embedded in that root were fragments of bone, human, unmistakably female. The air, Carter later wrote, moved like something breathing, slow and steady, as if the ground itself had lungs. Within hours, the lead archaeologist ordered the chamber resealed and the area marked off. The official report listed the site as unstable, dangerous, no further excavation recommended. But one intern secretly kept a piece of the root as a souvenir. 3 weeks later, he fell ill with a fever that no doctor could explain. Before dying, he told his sister he heard whispers in the walls. Women speaking a language that felt like wind through wood. That piece of root still exists, preserved in a private collection in Baton Rouge. Microscopic tests conducted decades later revealed traces of human DNA embedded deep within the fibers. Even today, locals say the magnolia trees around Briar Hollow never stop blooming, not even in drought or frost. If you've listened this far, whisper this phrase and let the story settle in your bones. What breathes below never sleeps. In 1980, a young investigative journalist named Clara Jean Dupree arrived in Monroe, Louisiana, following a rumor she first heard from a retired archivist. There's a plantation out there that never died. Dupree, barely 27 and hungry for a breakthrough story, specialized in uncovering buried truths from the Reconstruction era. She had no idea that Briar Hollow would become her obsession and her undoing. Her first clue came from an elderly man living in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. He introduced himself only as Leland Carter Jr., the son of the WPA archaeologist who'd first descended into the chamber in 1936. In a whispering voice, he said, "My daddy used to talk in his sleep. He said the cellar still breathes. Said he heard women singing in the dirt." He handed Clara a small tin box. Inside were 3 cassette tapes, labeled BH1, BH3, and a strip of magnolia bark carved with a circle and line symbol. He told her not to play the tapes after midnight. Of course she did. The first tape was nothing unusual, ambient noise, faint wind, static. The second began the same way but slowly built into a low rhythmic hum. At precisely 30:17 a.m., Clara's recorder captured what she described in her field notes as a sound like dozens of women exhaling at once. The third tape changed everything. Through the hiss and static, a voice emerged. A woman's, faint but deliberate, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Beneath the roots, we wait." Clara traced the location using the coordinates scribbled on the tape case. When she visited the site 2 days later, she found only magnolia trees and, half buried in the mud, a rusted iron ring set into the ground. She returned that night with her equipment, recording until dawn. The next morning, she phoned her editor in New Orleans. Her voice was trembling. She said, "They're not gone. The ground's still breathing." That was her last call. Her car was found at the edge of the property, headlights still on, doors open. The tapes were gone. Only her microphone remained, its red light blinking in the dark. And on the dashboard, carved into the dust, were 5 letters burned in with heat. "Before we move to what investigators discovered years later, type this twice to hold her courage." Clara heard them. The roots answered. In 2003, nearly 23 years after Clara Dupree's disappearance, her name resurfaced in a graduate thesis at Louisiana State University. A sound engineering student named Andre Keller had discovered a set of unmarked reel-to-reel recordings donated anonymously to the university's archive. The handwriting on the box label was unmistakable: C.J. Dupree Field Tapes, Briar Hollow. At first, Keller believed he was restoring old nature recordings. But when he cleaned the audio and ran a digital frequency analysis, he noticed something that defied every law of sound physics. Beneath the wind, beneath the static, there pulsed a rhythm, steady, organic, like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. The frequency repeated every 42 seconds, perfectly timed, as though the earth itself were breathing. Intrigued, Keller isolated the pattern and slowed it down to human tempo. What emerged chilled him. The pulse wasn't random. It formed syllabic shapes, phonetic waves that mirrored the cadence of speech. When he mapped those frequencies to spectrogram images, letters began to appear, 3 at a time, repeating again and again. Mercy, the name Mercy. Keller presented his findings at a university seminar. Attendees laughed at first, assuming it was a hoax. But when he replayed the full restored segment, several listeners reported feeling short of breath, dizzy. Some even claimed they heard whispering just behind them. Within hours, the recording was sealed by university officials and labeled restricted psychological hazard. A week later, Keller vanished. His apartment was found undisturbed, his hard drives missing. The only note left on his desk read, "The sound is not coming from the tape. It's coming from underneath." A month later, construction crews digging new power lines near the old Briar Hollow site struck an underground cavity filled with roots. Thick, gnarled, and pulsing faintly with trapped air, the crew sealed it immediately. 2 workers quit the same day, saying the ground was breathing. No official record of that discovery exists, but residents nearby began reporting strange tremors at night, soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. If you've made it this far, say it softly twice to steady yourself against what's next. The ground remembers every name. In 2020, when Louisiana's Flood Control Commission broke ground for a new levee near the old Briar Hollow site, workers once again disturbed the earth that locals had avoided for generations. Within a day, the diggers struck a layer of limestone shot through with magnolia roots. Sensors registered a strange, rhythmic vibration, so the crew halted operations and called in a small team from LSU's Department of Geology and Anthropology to study what they assumed was a natural gas vent. The team lowered a fiber optic camera through a narrow fissure. What appeared on the monitor looked like a cavern. Stone walls, a pool of black water, and along the floor, hundreds of pale shapes. At first they thought they were shells, then the camera focused. They were bones, fused with wood. The magnolia roots had grown through them, wrapping ribs and femurs the way vines claim a fence. Dr. Helen Guzman, the site lead, described the phenomenon in her field log. The entire chamber moves. When the wind dies, the water ripples anyway as if exhaling. Samples were taken under sterile conditions and sent to a university lab. 2 weeks later, the results came back inconclusive. The organic matter wasn't fully plant or animal. Its genetic sequence contained fragments of human mitochondrial DNA spliced with fungal and arboreal cells. An impossible hybrid. The report was classified as anomaly ABH 2020-14 and quietly filed away. The parish ordered the site resealed, citing structural instability. But before the fill crews arrived, Dr. Guzman recorded one final note. At 03:42 a.m. her equipment picked up a low-frequency pulse, 42-second intervals, the same rhythm Keller had identified 17 years earlier. The waveform, when converted to audio, formed a whispering tone pattern that analysts later mapped to the phrase. Mercy lit the fire. That night the camera feed cut out, the monitors flashing white for 6 seconds before returning to static. When workers reopened the fissure the next morning, the chamber had collapsed completely. The water, the bones, the roots, all gone. Only a hollow cavity remained perfectly smooth, as if something had drawn itself back into the earth. Today, a concrete levee covers the spot. Locals say on humid nights the magnolia blossoms open at midnight and release a scent like candle smoke. If you're still listening, whisper once, just once, Mercy's roots are resting. By 2024, Briar Hollow existed only on satellite maps, a grey scar swallowed by levees, half swamp and half forgotten. No signposts marked the site, no monuments rose for the people who lived and died there. Yet the story refused to stay buried. Every few years, someone came searching, filmmakers, historians, ghost hunters, descendants tracing family lines that led, somehow, back to that plantation where no slave woman ever ran away. One of them was Naomi Vance, a genealogist from Atlanta, and by blood, a distant descendant of Colonel Abram Vance himself. She had grown up hearing whispers that her family's wealth came from the ground. When she discovered the book of names listed 3 women bearing her great-grandmother's first name, she knew the myth was real. Naomi visited the levee one August night, bringing only a lantern and a recorder. What she captured there remains one of the most chilling sound files ever archived by the State Library. At first, only crickets and the slow wash of water. Then, beneath the hum, came the pulse. 42 seconds apart like always, and after the 5th pulse, a woman's voice, faint but steady, "We're still here." Mercy lit the fire. "You carry the ashes." Naomi never shared the recording publicly, but a transcript leaked through a historian's forum months later. Some called it a hoax, a trick of layered sound. Others swore they recognized a second voice overlapping the first, whispering the same phrase in reverse. When state engineers inspected the levee later that year, they noted the magnolia trees blooming wildly along the ridge, thousands of blossoms in full flower though the season had long passed. Beneath one of those trees, workers found a small object protruding from the soil, a rusted iron tag engraved EH0453. They turned it in as scrap metal. 2 days later, the magnolia tree above it split down the center without wind or storm. Inside the trunk, workers said they saw something glimmer, smooth, white, and shaped like bone. The site was sealed again. But some nights, fishermen swear the levee hums softly, like breath rising from below. If you followed Mercy's story from beginning to end, say her name now, quietly, respectfully. Not as a prayer, not as a warning, as remembrance. Mercy. If you've reached this point, you've walked through nearly 2 centuries of whispers, names stripped from ledgers, breath caught between soil and stone. What remains of Briar Hollow today is not a ruin, but a question: how does the earth remember what people try to erase? Every surviving document, the Book of Names, the WPA logs, Reverend Monroe's journal, exists in fragments. Each version contradicts another, and yet the pattern holds. The same names, the same intervals, the same sound beneath the soil. Whether one believes the cellar truly breathed or not, its history reveals something darker than the supernatural deliberate control, cruelty recorded as science. The true horror was never the whispering earth. It was the men who taught it to speak. Historians now argue that Briar Hollow may have been a network of smaller plantations operating under one hidden experiment. Part breeding program, part medical study, disguised by agricultural ledgers. None of the academics will say it aloud, but Mercy's story feels less like myth and more like resistance. A girl who burned a system down and left a symbol no one could decode, until now. In 2022, a digital humanities team used AI pattern recognition on surviving carvings and symbols recovered from the site. When rendered in 3D, the circular marks formed a geometric spiral that mirrored a human fingerprint. Mercy's. Her mark wasn't a curse, it was a claim. A way of saying, you took everything, but even the soil will remember my name. That's what this story truly is, remembrance. The magnolia trees still bloom at Briar Hollow. The levee hums. The archives hold more questions than answers. And somewhere in those patterns of breath and bone, a young woman's defiance continues to echo. If you've listened, if you've felt the air shift while hearing her name, you've become part of that remembering. Type her name once below, not as superstition, but as solidarity. Mercy. Then close your eyes and breathe once with the rhythm of the earth. Not in fear, not in mourning, but in witness. When I finally stood at the edge of the property myself, the air felt unnaturally still. The year was 2024, but the silence was the same silence described by Brennan, by Monroe, by every trembling witness who'd ever written the name Briar Hollow. The magnolias had thickened into walls of green, roots like petrified vines locking the ground in place. Beneath them, the earth sagged slightly, an indentation shaped by centuries of pressure. Locals called it the hollow's breath. A caretaker from the parish walked beside me, a woman named Elise. She was 72, sharp-eyed and cautious with her words. "People still don't like you saying her name too loud," she murmured. "The story isn't history here, it's inheritance." The air inside the old barn tasted of copper and humidity. Its timbers leaned like tired ribs. And there, half buried under dust, we found what modern archaeologists had missed. Metal fittings fused to the floorboards, small, circular, and perfectly aligned, each one corresponding to where the ledgers claimed the cells once stood. No bodies, no bones, just absence, structured and precise. Elise touched one of the rings. "Every family that worked this land," she said, "kept a secret about where the children went." She didn't mean it as a metaphor. As we stood there, A gust rolled through the collapsed roof. It carried with it the faintest sound, wind passing through hollow wood, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. I felt it in my chest more than in my ears, the same slow pulse that must have haunted the men who built this place. And for the first time, I understood the meaning of the phrase, "the women never ran." They couldn't. The soil itself was their chain. When we stepped outside, the sun had turned amber. Elise pointed toward the fields. "They planted cotton here again," she said softly, "to cover what the fire didn't burn. It's strange how time repeats its shapes, how the living keep sewing new stories over old graves. If you're still here, still listening, remember, some truths don't die. They just change their language. And if you feel that faint hum through your speaker right now, you're not imagining it. Type the phrase, 'The Earth Remembers,' twice in the comments to seal this truth within you." 2 months after that visit, the University of Charleston excavation team reopened the eastern foundation of the barn. The goal was routine, surveying postbellum construction layers, but what they uncovered reawakened everything the state had tried to bury. Wrapped in oilcloth, preserved by decades of clay and ash, lay a small leather volume, the final ledger of Briar Hollow. Not Routledge's careful hand, not the overseer's script. The handwriting was different, sharper, deliberate, feminine. It was hers. The pages were fragile, the ink rust-colored and faint, but legible enough to read. Each entry began the same way, a date, a single name, and then a line written like a prayer. Let it be counted in reverse. Beneath that, what appeared to be measurements, weights, notations, but none matched known birth records. When the historians transcribed them, a pattern emerged. The numbers corresponded perfectly to the ages of the sold children, counting backward. It wasn't a ledger of births. It was a ledger of returns. Every name once marked, sold, in Routledge's original books was inscribed again here. In Mercy's hand, each number reversed as if summoning them home. She'd turned his system against him. The Cellar's order, the precision, the bloodline science. She inverted it all. Through numbers and repetition, she transformed bookkeeping into rebellion. Every entry was a ritual of reclamation. The last page bore no numbers, only a sentence. "When the last breath is measured, the soil will speak for us." That discovery changed everything. The university sealed the volume, labeled it Artifact 12C, Undesignated Ledger, Fairhaven Briar Hollow Project. But when the restoration technician scanned its surface, the same circular fingerprint pattern reappeared faintly across multiple pages. Not printed, burned into the fibers. Some say it's an optical illusion. Others believe it's Mercy's mark, pressed there the night of the fire, when the barn ignited from beneath. But the archivist who handled it claimed something else, that the smell of magnolia filled the lab as she turned the final page. Truth or superstition? Does it matter? The evidence stands. The ledger existed, the names exist, the silence is finally broken, and now each time a researcher reads her words aloud, the air seems to tremble just slightly, as if the earth itself is exhaling after holding its breath for over a century. The fire that ended Briar Hollow was never entered in official records. The Charleston Gazette listed it as an agricultural accident, probable lightning. But the storm that night had no lightning. Witnesses from neighboring plantations described something else, a deep vibration that rolled through the ground before the blaze ever began. The surviving overseer, a man named Tulliver Briggs, gave a deposition months later. His words were dismissed as delirium, yet they match oral histories passed through generations of the freed families. "It weren't thunder," Briggs wrote. "It came from the ground, like the cellar had lungs." He said the animals screamed before the smoke rose, that the soil cracked open in straight lines, running from the barn to the levee like veins filled with fire. By the time dawn came, the main house had collapsed into itself. Every ledger, every chain, every trace of the experiment was ash, except for Mercy's small book, later found beneath a layer of cooled soil. But the strangest detail came from the survivors who'd been hiding in the fields. They claimed to hear voices, hundreds of them, chanting in rhythm with the pulse of the earth. Not screams, not prayers, just one sentence, repeated again and again: "We are still counted." No one ever found Mercy's body. Some say she was consumed by the fire she called down. Others insist she walked away through the cypress swamp, covered in soot, leaving her final mark on the levee with her bare hand. That handprint, half burned into the mud, remained visible until the flood of 1912. In 1987, a hurricane unearthed part of the foundation again. Locals who visited the site swore the air hummed with a low tone when they stood near the surviving stone rings. Scientists blamed seismic resonance, but those who knew the story didn't need proof. They called it the night the earth spoke back, because for once it wasn't a cry, it was a reply. Every injustice, every scream that had gone unanswered under the weight of centuries finally found a voice in the soil. And that, perhaps, is why Mercy's name still echoes, not as a ghost's, but as the sound of the ground itself remembering. Today, the land where Briar Hollow once stood is quiet, but not untouched. The old plantation fields have become part of a state, protected wetland reserve, ringed with reeds and magnolia saplings that seem to grow faster than anywhere else in the region. Nothing thrives long in the center clearing, where the barn once stood. The soil there stays dark, damp, and strangely warm year-round. In 2023, a joint archaeological and forensic study returned to the site under the direction of Dr. Kendra Lay, a cultural anthropologist specializing in sites of suppressed trauma. Her team used ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface anomalies. What they found was chilling. Beneath the surface lay a perfect spiral pattern, identical to the one encoded in Mercy's ledger. 37 distinct heat signatures, equidistant, circular, and resonating faintly through magnetometric readings. Dr. Lay's published paper, Resonant Memory and the Materiality of Resistance, described the anomaly as a collective imprint, possibly an unintentional memorial created through repeated ritual motion and combustion. But in her private journal, leaked months later, she wrote something else entirely. The soil vibrates when you say her name. This is not metaphor. We recorded it. The recordings were confiscated by state officials within days, citing equipment malfunction. Yet one clip survived online, a 3-second waveform that pulses at 11 hertz, too low for most human ears but powerful enough to make glass tremble. Internet users began calling it the Mercy tone. Artists remixed it into songs. Historians debated it. Skeptics dismissed it as seismic interference. But people who listened long enough claimed to feel something beneath the sound. A heartbeat, like rhythm, slow, deliberate, grounding. Briar Hollow became more than a footnote in Southern history. It became a symbol. Activists invoked Mercy's name during land reclamation movements, calling her the archivist of the forgotten. And maybe that's the final truth here. Not horror but endurance. Not ghosts but memory made permanent. The spiral beneath the soil is still there. The ledgers, the names, the fingerprints, they all point toward the same thing, that even when history tries to silence the enslaved, the earth itself will testify. And every time someone whispers, the earth remembers. The wind through those magnolia trees seems to answer back, soft, steady, alive. The camera drifts slowly over the wetlands where Briar Hollow once stood, the sun sinking low behind the black silhouettes of magnolias. Mist crawls across the ground, and the air hums faintly, almost imperceptible, like the sound of something old breathing just beneath the surface. A single figure walks through the field, their footsteps sinking slightly into the dark soil. The voiceover begins, soft, deliberate, echoing with the tone of remembrance rather than fear. History isn't buried, it waits. Beneath our feet, beneath the stories they told us were over. The names written in ledgers weren't erased, they were planted. And sometimes when the world is quiet enough, the earth exhales and those names rise again. The camera moves closer to the spot where the barn once stood. There's nothing left but a circle of damp earth, faintly steaming under the pale light. The sound of the Mercy tone hums beneath the narration, low and rhythmic. Mercy's story was never about vengeance. It was about balance. About what happens when the weight of cruelty presses down so long that the ground itself learns to remember. She didn't haunt them. She taught the soil to speak. The shot widens, showing the spiral pattern faintly illuminated by the fading sun, a perfect imprint of symmetry and defiance. And maybe that's what all memory really is, a vibration that refuses to die. Every generation feels it, even if they can't name it. It's in the rhythm of our footsteps, in the hum of the wind through the fields, in the heartbeat we mistake for silence. The music swells, an ethereal choral sound built around the 11 Hertz frequency, blending science and spirit into one pulse. The screen begins to fade to black, but before it does, a single white phrase appears in bold serif font, THERH remembias. Then the voice returns one last time, quiet, intimate. Almost a whisper. She was never a ghost. She was the ground you walk on. The hum lingers even after the final frame fades, lasting 3 seconds longer than it should. Long enough for the listener to feel it resonate in their chest. Long enough to make them wonder if something ancient just sighed beneath them. As the hum of the mercy tone fades, the screen remains black for a moment, silent, heavy, deliberate. Then white text begins to appear, slow and steady, accompanied by the distant sound of rain on leaves. It reads, dedicated to the forgotten, to those whose stories were taken, whose names were rewritten, whose silence was mistaken for absence. Beneath that, a single line, inspired by real accounts of postbellum Southern archives and oral histories. The music returns, soft strings, minimal piano, rising with a tone of reverence rather than horror. The credits scroll over faint, sepia-toned images of the land today, the magnolia trees swaying, the waterline shimmering, a child's hand brushing against soil as if tracing something beneath it. The narrator's voice returns one final time, not as a storyteller now, but as a witness. This film is not about ghosts. It is about the record, the ones they tried to burn, the names they tried to measure, and the voices that turned to roots instead of ashes. Mercy's name lives not in the ledgers of the powerful, but in the breath of the earth itself. And when we speak her name, we are not calling her spirit, we are continuing her count. The music deepens, blending archival sounds with low-frequency echoes of the recorded soil vibrations from the site. Text fades in, every name matters, every silence holds a sound, every ground remembers. A QR code flashes briefly, leading viewers to the Briar Hollow Memorial Archive, a fictional project created for the documentary, where visitors can read the transcribed names from the recovered ledger and submit names from their own family histories of displacement or bondage. Then, the screen dims again, leaving only one final quote attributed to Mercy herself, her handwriting recreated from the ledger, "Count backward, and you will find me." The screen pulses once with the faint ripple of the spiral pattern, then fades completely to black. No sound, no closing theme, just silence, the kind that feels alive, waiting like breath drawn before a word is spoken. And in that silence, one last sentence appears in small, white text. Because remembering is a kind of resurrection. When the filming ended, I thought I could walk away from Briar Hollow. I told myself it was just another story, another excavation of pain turned into narrative. But the silence followed me home. It crept into the spaces between my own words, into the hum of the refrigerator at night, into the soft tremor that ran through the floor whenever it rained. I started dreaming of the spiral, the same pattern found beneath the soil. Sometimes it pulsed faintly behind my eyelids, like a living thing trying to remember itself through me. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, the weight of too much darkness compressed into too few hours of sleep. But then, one night while reviewing the final audio cut, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A faint whisper, barely audible, layered under the narrator's closing line. I isolated it, filtered it, slowed it down. 3 words emerged through the static, steady, deliberate, almost kind. "You counted right." I played it again and again, each time certain it was just interference or subconscious suggestion. But no matter how I adjusted the frequencies, the voice remained. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't haunting. It was peaceful. Gratitude, not grief. That night I returned to my notes and realized that the last entry in Mercy's ledger ended with an unfinished sentence. "Win the soil." The rest of the page was blank, scorched at the edges. And I think I understand now, it wasn't unfinished. It was an invitation to continue, to keep counting, to ensure that the names, the rhythms, the truths she carved out of silence wouldn't fade into academic dust. I still hear the hum sometimes, low and steady beneath my house. I know it's probably the old plumbing or the trains that pass 3 streets over. But on the nights I can't sleep, I open the window and listen, and if the wind is right, it sounds almost like breathing. Maybe that's all she wanted, to be remembered not as a ghost but as breath, as proof that the earth still carries her heartbeat, And every time I whisper her name now, I swear the ground beneath my feet grows just a little warmer. The archivist who catalogued the Briar Hollow ledger retired quietly in 2025. On her last day, she performed one final scan before sealing the book in temperature-controlled glass. When she checked the digital record, she noticed something impossible. A new line had appeared beneath the final entry. The ink was faint, the handwriting identical to Mercy's, slanted, precise, deliberate. 3 words, clear as daylight. The count is whole. The archivist deleted the file, terrified she had somehow corrupted it. But when she reopened the scan, the phrase remained. Even stranger, the fingerprint pattern, the spiral burned into the fibers, had expanded slightly, as if the book itself had taken a breath. A week later, during the official unveiling of the restored ledger at the State Archive, the glass case fogged over from the inside. The audience whispered, thinking it was a malfunction in the climate seal. When a technician wiped the condensation away, another faint phrase had appeared, written backward, as though pressed from within. "No, you remember." No one could explain it. The state called it a chemical reaction from preservation fluids. Historians cited oxidation. But those who had spent years tracing Mercy's story knew better. They didn't speak. They just looked at each other in silence. That same reverent, electric quiet that falls when something sacred crosses from legend into proof. And maybe that's how it was always meant to end. Not with fire or fear, but with completion. The circle closed. The spiral fulfilled. The count whole again. Today the ledger rests in a dark room, sealed behind museum glass, a soft light illuminating its final page. Visitors walk past it every day, without realizing the ground beneath their feet hums in that same quiet rhythm. And when the guide lowers her voice to recite the last words found there, you can almost feel the air itself lean in to listen. The count is whole. A pause. Then, in white text across the final black screen, THEERT remembias TENDRE. Mavirehets, the hum fades to silence. And somewhere beneath the magnolias, the soil exhales, soft, final, at peace.